Okay, we're back in chapter 10. We're in the unit number 3, 9, 10, 11. We're looking at the history of God's people, and what he's trying to do. Paul is saying that God has always been choosing people by a sovereign election, and he gets to choose the Gentiles as well. We kind of looked at God's first dealt with the world, then he dealt with the nation of Israel. But nation of Israel wasn't an end of itself. It was supposed to get to be an instrument to bring light to the world. They didn't, and then a remnant was chosen, which is a part of the nation, and that didn't work. So God chose one person, quote unquote, the true Israelite, the true man, the true Adam, and he dealt with the entire world's problem through one man. And through that one man, we have a remnant of 12 from the same, they were all Jewish, it's a remnant, and from that remnant, they moved to the Gentiles, which is the church, and from the church they went to the world. And so you can see in a very easy way of understanding how God has dealt biblically with his people and his church. We looked at the family tree of Abraham, and we saw how God had chosen some and disregarded others. And we said that Paul uses the example of a potter, and that the potter gets to do with the same lump of clay what he would either make a vessel of mercy or a vessel of wrath, and he gets to do so because he is God. That moves us to the present, and we're gonna deal right now with the Jewish people, what they feel about Christ, because this is a huge issue. I don't know if you've seen in Pinecrest, there's Orthodox Jews who have like the hat and they wear black. We have a lot in common with Jewish people, but only the beginning of the story, not the end. They're still waiting for the Messiah to come, and we believe that the Messiah is Jesus, and they don't believe that Jesus is the Christ. And so what's happening to the Jewish people now in the present is key to what he's doing in the future. So let's look at chapter 9:30 and chapter 10. It says, "What shall we say? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it, a righteousness that is by faith. But Israel who pursued it in the law of righteousness have not obtained it. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but by works." And so there's a paradox here. Excuse me. The Jewish people tried to find it through the law and couldn't find it. And the Gentiles weren't looking for it, but they found it by faith. And what happened was the Jewish people stumbled over the stumbling stone. And this is going to be Christ. In the present, it is a stumbling stone. Now, what does a stumbling stone mean? Stumbling stone means it becomes something they trip over. A Messiah that dies on the cross beneath pagan rule is a curse. That is not the Messiah they were looking for. They were looking for a Messiah that would be like David, be like Solomon, and bring the Jewish nation to prominence again, and be a military leader and a strong leader, not a no-named person who dies on a cross. And so they just can't accept it because of his death. So it becomes a stumbling stone to them. Now, it's really interesting that for some it becomes a stumbling stone, and in the present, some it becomes the corner stone. All right. Now, the cornerstone is that square stone that they used to use in the corner of a building in which the foundation is rested. So you either trip over Christ, or he becomes the basis on which all things are built. So the person of Christ is that one defining factor of who is in and who is not of the people of God. It is not a national thing. In verse 33, it says, "See, I lay Zion a stone that causes men to stumble, a rock that causes them to fall, and the one who trusts in him, that rock, will never be put to shame." So then he starts in chapter 10. He says, brothers, my heart's desire and prayer is for the Israelites that they may be saved. Remember, he's not just a cold theologian trying to make a point. He's talking about his family members, his cousins, his uncles, his aunts, maybe even his mother and his brothers, his dad. Because when he became a Christian, it's not like every one of his Jewish friends became Christians with him. They actually persecuted him. So he still wants them to be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God. And this is really key. Jewish people have a zeal and a devotion to God. But look what he says. But their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness that comes from God, they sought to establish their own righteousness. They did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the end of the law so they may be righteous for everyone who believes. They tried to be good enough. They held on to the law. And we've proven by chapters 1 through 4 that the law does not save. It cannot save. And they tried to be self-righteous. And if you're self-righteous and self-right with God, then you don't need Christ to be righteous for you. And so they reject Christ. Now, Moses describes this in a way. He says that the man who does these things will live by them. So they listened to Moses and he said, we're going to keep the law. But remember what we said about keeping the law. Can anyone keep it 24/7, 365 and be perfect? The answer is no. What is the purpose of the law? To show us our sin, to keep us within the boundaries to have a right relationship, and also to point us to perfection. And he says this thing here, it's pretty interesting. He says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the deep, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. So what is he saying here? He says, listen, you're creating a stumbling stone. He says, don't try to say that you can go up to heaven, all right? Because that brings Christ down and makes him like man. And don't say that you can go down to hell and pay the price, because that brings Christ up and makes him like what? Man. And he was like, listen, Christ is not man. He's 100% man and 100% God. He's completely different. And they just would consider him to be a man. He says, don't do that. And now he's saying, and remember, he's a missionary at heart. So he says, what do you say? The word is near you and is in your mouth and in your heart. And this is the word, the faith that we are proclaiming, that if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart and that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. He's saying, listen, it's not about the law again. You need to believe in the person, the work of Jesus Christ. It is for your heart that you will believe and you are justified, and with your mouth that you confess and are saved. It is the outworking of the heart in which you confess with your mouth. As Scripture says, anyone who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now this is key in verse 12. For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all and richly blessed all who call on him. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Both Jew and Gentile. Remember, that's the theme. He's trying to unite the church, both Jew and Gentile. Now, remember, he's a missionary and he wants to go actually to preach in Spain as well. So he says, how can they call on the name of the Lord? Because everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But how can they call on the name of the Lord on the one they believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they've not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet those who bring the good news. So he's saying, listen, the reason why I need you united is because people need to hear the gospel. And how can they hear if I'm not preaching? And I can only preach if you do what? Send me. Be the church. This is the thing. We're the world, the nation, but now we're building on Christ. And Paul is part of this remnant, and he's building the church to affect the world. And he's saying, listen, be part of this with me. How beautiful is the feet that bring the knowledge of Jesus, the good news. But now, look what it says in verse 16, but not all Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and hearing is heard through the word of Christ. But you can ask, did they hear? Of course they did. Their voice had gone out to all the earth. And then I ask again, did they not understand? And Moses says, yeah, they understood. In the last little section of this, it says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. So what he's saying here is, unfortunately, the Jewish people at this time are stubborn and obstinate. God has held out his hands to them over time and space and given them this list. We saw in chapter 9, this list. Yours is the adoption. Yours is the divine glory. Yours is the covenant. Yours receiving the law, the temple, the worships, the promises, the patriarchs. And you can trace the human ancestry of Christ, who is God over all forever. Amen. But they missed the point. They're stubborn and obstinate. They won't see him as the cornerstone, and they trip over him. That's chapter 10, and we're going to see what happens in the future in chapter 11. Tune back in, answer your questions. We'll see you later.